Imagine trying to understand a living language by merely memorizing a dictionary, focusing only on isolated definitions without speaking to native speakers or immersing yourself in their culture. You might grasp basic vocabulary, but you'll miss the deeper meanings, nuances, and emotional connections that only become clear through conversation and context. Gavin argues that studying religion faces a similar problem when relying solely on phenomenology and presents a compelling alternative grounded in dialogue, narrative, and cultural context. Flood argues persuasively that religion cannot be understood through a detached, purely rational observer, as phenomenology proposes. So, he advocates a method that embraces historical context, communication, and a recognition of the situated nature of both researchers and their subjects. Here's the game plan for our journey through Gavin Flood's ideas in his book Beyond Phenomenology. First stop, identifying the fault lines. We'll zoom in on why the dominant methods, phenomenology or naturalistic reduction, no longer cut it. Second stop, Flood's proposal. We dive into Flood's dialogical narrative-driven approach that trades detached observation for real conversation. Finally, the big so what? Flood highlights how this shift reshapes questions of ethics, truth claims, and the way religion is studied today. Identifying the fault lines, the limits of phenomenology or naturalistic reduction. Phenomenology, prominent in religious studies, encourages scholars to bracket their biases and contexts to objectively examine religious phenomena. It implicitly assumes an abstract, rational consciousness detached from history and culture. Flood critiques this presumption, noting it smuggles in hidden Enlightenment ideals, neutral rationality, ahistorical universalism that fail to reflect how religions actually operate in lived human context. Moreover, Flood bemoans naturalistic reduction, in which religion is explained purely through external factors, economic forces for Marxists, evolutionary genome advantage for sociobiologists, or repressed wishes for Freudians. Naturalistic reduction seeks causal explanation external to believers, overlooking the significance of insider narratives. As Flood points out, this approach cannot adequately explain religious intentions or beliefs, since it tries to understand subjective experiences by reducing them to external phenomena. In Flood's view, these effectively ignore history in the name of neutrality and meaning in the name of causality by severing religion from the tradition that gives it life. Now to Flood's proposal, from consciousness to dialogue and narrative. Flood's proposed corrective pivots from a philosophy of consciousness toward a philosophy of the sign, where language, narrative, and communication become primary lenses for understanding religion. Rather than reducing religion to either subjective consciousness or external causal forces, Flood suggests that religions are best understood as culturally embedded systems of communication, carriers of shared meaning transmitted through narratives, rituals, text, and historical traditions. So, he emphasizes a dialogical approach inspired by thinkers such as Bakhtin and Ricoeur. Rather than positioning scholars as neutral observers, Flood acknowledges scholars are inevitably situated in particular historical and cultural context. Thus, understanding religion becomes an interactive process, acknowledging mutual influence and interpretation between researcher and the researched. Central to this dialogical method is narrative, stories and accounts that religions tell about origins, purposes, and identities. These narratives are not merely descriptive but formative. They shape communities, values, and identities. And Flood positions the narrative as essential because religions fundamentally operate by transmitting culturally valued meanings through generations, primarily via linguistic forms like text and symbolic forms like ritual. This dialogical approach offers richer insights precisely because it openly acknowledges the complexities and situatedness of religious experience, avoiding overly simplistic reductions. Now to the big so what, the ethics, truth, and reflexive scholarship. Flood's alternative methodology significantly impacts ethics, truth, and the role of religion in academia and beyond. Ethical implications. Flood insists that the study of religion is never ethically neutral. By moving beyond phenomenological detachment, scholars must recognize their relational role in dialogue with communities studied. The encounter with the religious others is ethically charged. Researchers must approach their subjects not merely as passive data, but as agents whose integrity and dignity must be respected. Thus, the dialogical approach entails an ethic of humility and openness, respecting the agency and humanity of those studied. Truth and contextuality. Flood further argues that religious truth claims cannot meaningfully be abstracted from context. He says, an abstracting of metaphysical truth claims is a recontextualization of those claims within the system of inquiry. Here again, Flood clarifies that scholars don't neutrally extract religious truths to assess their universal validity. Instead, scholars always reposition these claims within their own academic frameworks. The truths of religion thus become questions of meaning within particular traditions, rather than isolated propositions subject to detached verification. Thus, the task is less, is this religious claim universally verifiable, and more, how does this assertion function in shaping identity, authority, and moral imagination within its tradition, and how might it be heard in conversation with others? Reflexivity in scholarship. Finally, Flood emphasizes the need for reflexivity in religious studies. Scholars must transparently acknowledge their historical and cultural locations, openly recognizing their interpretive biases. Flood calls this dialogical reflexivity, a commitment to critically examining one's own narrative foundations while studying the narratives of others. This reflexivity sharpens scholarship, fostering deeper self-awareness and accountability within religious inquiry. Now, here are some challenges. Flood's contribution is significant, bridging theoretical sophistication and practical relevance. By critiquing traditional phenomenological, reductionist methodologies, he enriches religious studies through a sophisticated yet accessible argument for a narrative-informed dialogical inquiry. His method offers a nuanced middle ground, neither falling into simplistic relativism nor asserting rigid universalism. Flood's insights align with broader contemporary academic shifts towards recognizing historical contingency and situated knowledge. However, the dialogical approach presents certain practical challenges. It demands substantial linguistic and cultural expertise, suggesting that truly effective studies might require interdisciplinary teams. Additionally, scholars deeply committed to phenomenology or reductionist methodologies might resist Flood's reframing, arguing his approach potentially diminishes empirical rigor or risks relativistic fragmentation. Nevertheless, Flood's method allows for respectful yet rigorous engagement with diverse religious traditions, enriching public discourse. By emphasizing dialogue and narrative, Flood moves religious studies beyond detached observation towards meaningful interaction and understanding, toward a richer engagement with religion. So essentially, in his book Beyond Phenomenology, Gavin Flood advocates a study of religion rooted in dialogue, narrative, and ethical reflexivity. Rejecting both the abstractions of phenomenological consciousness and the flattening of naturalistic reduction, he treats traditions as dynamic webs of meaning situated in history and culture. The 2025 International Booker Laureate Banu Mustaq of Karnataka says, "My writing is a dialogue with the masses." Flood strikes the same note. Religious inquiry too must converse with living communities. His proposal nurtures respectful encounter, broader understanding, and disciplined humility, calling scholars and the wider public to engage religious complexity through sustained, open conversation that can reshape both research and general perception.